Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the endless darkness between stars, in tombs buried beneath worlds that remember when galaxies were young, ancient machines stir from sleep that has lasted 60 million years. The Necrons, once the proud Necron Tyre, now imprisoned in bodies of living metal, are awakening to a galaxy they no longer recognize. Among the countless changes that have reshaped reality during their long slumber, one figure stands out as both utterly alien and strangely familiar to their ancient minds: the Emperor of mankind, a being of such immense psychic power that his light burns through the warp itself, guiding humanity across the stars. But what do these ancient Xenos truly know about this golden lord of humanity? What secrets have they gleaned about the master of mankind during their scattered awakenings? But the answer to these questions reveals not just what the Necrons know, but what they cannot possibly understand about a being who represents everything they have fought against for countless millennia. This is not a simple tale of knowledge shared across species. This is a story of perspectives so fundamentally different that they might as well exist in separate universes, even when standing on the same battlefield. The Necrons view reality through lenses forged in wars that predate humanity's evolution, shaped by sciences that bend the fundamental laws of the cosmos, colored by hatreds that have festered for longer than most stars have burned. When they look upon the Emperor, they see something that should not exist, something that violates every principle they once held dear. To understand what the Necrons know about the Emperor, thus we must first understand the vast gulf that separates their experiences from anything a human mind can truly comprehend. We must journey back not thousands of years, not millions, but tens of millions of years, to a time when the galaxy sang with the songs of the old ones, and the stars themselves trembled before the hunger of beings that fed on their light. The question of what the Necrons know about the Emperor is fascinating precisely because it forces us to confront the limitations of perspective itself. How does a race that remembers the war in heaven, that once shattered gods and nearly ended the universe itself, view a psychic titan who has guided humanity for a mere 10,000 years? What information have they gathered during their fitful awakenings over the past millennia? What do their ancient archives contain about this golden sovereign who commands legions in his name? The answers to these questions paint a picture far more complex than simple enmity or ignorance. They reveal a tapestry of limited knowledge, strategic assessment, fundamental misunderstanding, and perhaps most intriguingly, a few threads of insight that humanity itself might not possess. The Necrons are a species defined by their relationship to knowledge. Before their transformation into unliving machines, when they were still the Necron tier, they were a race of brilliant scientists and engineers, pushing the boundaries of what technology could achieve. They mapped the stars when other races were still learning to harness fire. They built weapons that could crack planets and engines that could traverse the galaxy in moments. Oh, they achieved immortality, though not in the way they had hoped. That legacy of scientific achievement still burns within their mechanical minds, driving them to catalogue, analyze, and understand everything they encounter. When the Necrons observe the Emperor, they do so with the cold precision of beings who have spent millions of years studying the fundamental nature of reality. But that same clinical approach becomes their greatest limitation. For the Emperor is not simply a phenomenon to be measured and catalogued. He is something that exists as much in faith and myth as in objective reality. And the Necrons, beings utterly severed from the warp, can never fully grasp what that means. The Necrons, ancient masters of a forgotten age. To comprehend what the Necrons know, we must first understand who they are, what they were, and what they have become across the vast stretches of time that separate their golden age from the current dark millennium. The Necrons were not always the soulless automatons that stalk the battlefields of the 41st millennium. Once, countless eons ago, they were the Necron Tyre, a race of beings made of flesh and blood, born under a cruel and unforgiving star in the region of space known as the Halo stars. Their existence was defined by suffering. The radiation from their sun caused terrible cancers and shortened their lifespans to mere decades, sometimes less. Where other races lived for centuries, the Necrontyr measured their lives in years. Where other civilizations built slowly across generations, the Necrontyr were driven by a terrible urgency, knowing that death would claim them before they could see the fruits of their labor. This curse of mortality shaped everything about Necrontyr society. They became obsessed with death, with achievement, with leaving behind legacies that would outlast their brief and painful existences. They built monuments that reached toward the stars, carved their names in stone that would endure when their flesh had long since turned to dust. They developed technologies that pushed far beyond what should have been possible for beings with such short lives. The pressure of their mortality compressed centuries of innovation into decades, forcing brilliant minds to work with frantic intensity before the cancers claimed them. Their culture was a race against time itself, and in that race, they achieved wonders that other races would take millennia to match. But all the while, they looked up at other races, at the old ones who seemed to live forever, and they burned with jealousy so intense it transformed into hatred. The old ones were everything the Necrontyr were not. They were ancient beyond measuring, beings who had walked among the stars since before the galaxy had taken its current shape. They possessed mastery over the warp, the chaotic sea of psychic energy that existed parallel to real space. They could manipulate the very fabric of reality through their understanding of this dimension, creating races, shaping worlds, guiding the evolution of life itself across countless systems. To the Necrontyr, dying before they reached middle age by human standards, and watching children succumb to the cancers that riddled their bodies, the old ones represented a cosmic injustice. These beings lived for millions of years, perhaps forever, while the Necrontyr were born only to suffer and die. The Necrontyr sent emissaries to the old ones, begging for the secret of immortality, pleading for aid against the curse of their dying star. The old ones, in their ancient wisdom, or perhaps their arrogance, refused. They saw the Necrontyr as a young and aggressive race, and perhaps they sensed what that bitterness and desperation might drive them to do if they were granted eternal life. That refusal was the spark that ignited a fire that would consume the galaxy. The Necrontyr, united by their rage at the Old One's rejection, declared war. The Silent King Zarek, as the last ruler of the Triarch that governed the Necrontyr Empire, directed the full force of his civilization toward a conflict they could not possibly win. The Old Ones commanded powers the Necrontyr could barely comprehend, mastery over the warp that allowed them to manipulate reality itself. They created warrior races to fight their battles, including the ancient Krork, predecessors to the greenskin hordes that would later plague the galaxy. They raised up the Eldar to heights of psychic might that made them nearly unstoppable. Against these forces, the Necrontyr should have been annihilated in the opening decades of the conflict. But desperation breeds innovation, and the Necrontyr were the most desperate race the galaxy had ever seen. The war dragged on for centuries, each battle bringing new defeats for the Necrontyr. Their technology was formidable, their weapons devastating, but they could not match the warp mastery of the Old Ones and their servants. The Necrontyr Empire began to fracture under the weight of endless losses. Internal divisions that had been suppressed by external threats began to resurface. The Second Wars of Secession threatened to tear apart what little unity remained. The Silent King found himself ruling an empire on the brink of collapse, fighting a war he could not win against enemies who seemed to grow stronger with each passing decade. In this darkest hour, when extinction seemed inevitable, the Necrontyr encountered beings that offered them the power they needed to turn the tide. These were the Satan, the star gods, creatures of pure energy that fed on the light of suns. They existed in the material realm, not the warp, and they possessed power on a scale that rivaled the Old Ones themselves. The Deceiver, one of the most cunning of the Satan, approached the Silent King with an offer that seemed like salvation. The Satan could grant the Necrontyre immortality, an end to the suffering caused by their deadly son, eternal life in bodies that would never know pain or death. All they required was that the Necrontyre transfer their consciousness into shells of living metal, abandoning their flesh forever in a process called biotransference. The Silent King's court advisor, Orican the Diviner, warned against the bargain, his visions showing a terrible cost that the deceiver did not reveal. But the Silent King, driven by desperation and the weight of his dying people, accepted the C'tan's offer. It was the greatest mistake any leader has ever made in the history of the galaxy, a decision whose consequences echo across the millennia, even now. The Necrontyre entered the furnaces of biotransference as living beings and emerged as the Necrons, machines animated by fragments of their former consciousness. Their souls burned away in the transition, leaving only cold metal shells driven by programming and the tattered remains of what they had once been. The transformation granted them power beyond imagining. The Necron warriors became nearly indestructible, able to repair damage that would have killed any organic being, capable of fighting on for millennia without rest or sustenance. Their weapons grew more terrible, powered by the technologies the C'tan shared with them, Gauss flayers that could strip matter from existence, resurrection protocols that could rebuild destroyed bodies from their constituent atoms. The nobility retained more of their consciousness than the common soldiers, who were reduced to mindless automatons, following programmed instructions. The higher the Necrontyre's rank had been, the more of their minds survived the transition. The Silent King himself received the most sophisticated Necron body, maintaining cognitive functions far beyond those of his subjects. But all of them, from the lowest warrior to the Silent King himself, had lost something fundamental in the transformation. Their souls were gone, burned away in the furnaces of biotransference, leaving them severed from the warp forever. They could never again touch the sea of souls, could never draw upon psychic power, yes, could never experience the connection to the Imperium that defined existence for so many other races. They were now creatures purely of the material realm, masters of physics and technology, but blind to the other half of reality. With their new immortal forms, the Necrons turned the tide of the war in heaven. They drove back the Old One's armies, matching the psychic might of the Eldar with weapons that ignored the laws of physics as lesser races understood them. They hunted the Old Ones themselves, killing gods who had walked among the stars since before memory. But even as they achieved victory after victory, the Silent King realized the full horror of what he had done. The C'tan had never intended to grant true immortality to the Necrontyre. They had enslaved them, turned them into tools to be used and discarded. And the C'tan fed on the life force of the Necrontyre during biotransference, gorging themselves on the souls of an entire civilization. The Necrons were their army, their weapons, their servants, bound by command protocols that forced obedience to these star gods who had betrayed them. The Silent King, who still retained enough of his mind to understand the depths of his mistake, began to plan a rebellion that would make the war against the Old Ones seem like a minor skirmish. When the Old Ones had finally been destroyed, when their civilization lay in ruins and their creations were scattered across the galaxy without guidance, the Silent King struck. He had spent centuries preparing for this moment, secretly developing weapons that could harm the C'tan, while technologies so terrible that he would later erase knowledge of them from his warriors' minds, lest they be used again. The Necrons turned on their masters with the full fury of a race that had been betrayed twice, first by the Old One's refusal, and then by the C'tan's deception. The war against the star gods was brief but catastrophic. The forces unleashed during those battles damaged causality itself, creating wounds in space-time that would never fully heal. But the Necrons succeeded where others had failed. They could not destroy the C'tan, for these beings were fundamental parts of reality, but they could shatter them. Each C'tan was broken into thousands of shards, fragments of their whole consciousness, still immensely powerful, but no longer godlike entities. These shards were imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths, our pocket dimensions from which they could not escape, held by the very race they had enslaved. Victory over the Cetan should have been the Necrons' greatest triumph. They had defeated the Old Ones and their star god masters. They had proven themselves the supreme military power in the galaxy. But the cost of these victories had been astronomical. The war in heaven had damaged the galaxy itself, torn the fabric of reality, and given birth to predators in the warp that fed on psychic energy. The enslavers, terrible entities from beyond, poured through the wounds in reality and began to feast on the psycho races that the Old Ones had created. The galaxy descended into madness and death. The Necrons looked upon the ruins of the civilization they had fought to conquer and realized they were too exhausted to claim their prize. Yet the war had lasted so long, cost so much, drained even their immortal forms to the point where they could barely continue. And now they faced a new threat in the Eldar, the Old One's greatest creation, who had grown powerful during the war and now stood ready to oppose the Necrons' claim to galactic dominance. The Silent King made another fateful decision, one that would shape the course of the next 60 million years. He ordered the Necrons to withdraw to their tomb worlds and enter the Great Sleep, a hibernation that would last for millions of years. By the time they awoke, he reasoned, the Eldar would have declined, the warp storms would have subsided, and the galaxy would be ripe for conquest. The Necrons would slumber in perfect stasis, their consciousness suspended, their bodies sealed in crypts deep beneath the surfaces of their worlds. They would wait out the aftermath of the war they had won, sleeping until the time was right to reclaim their dominion. The Silent King, however, did not join his people in their rest. Racked with guilt over what he had done to his race, over the choice to accept the Satan's bargain and the transformation that had stolen their souls, he destroyed the command protocols that gave him absolute control over all Necrons. Then he left the galaxy entirely, exiling himself to the void between galaxies, taking with him a personal fleet and legions of his own dynasty, but leaving behind the empire he had doomed through his choices. For 60 million years, the Necrons slept. Human beings had not yet evolved. While the distant ancestors of humanity's ancestors were small mammals scurrying in the shadows of the great reptiles that ruled ancient Earth. Civilizations rose and fell in the galaxy. Entire species evolved and went extinct. Stars were born and died. And through it all, the Necrons dreamed their dreamless sleep beneath worlds that forgot they had ever existed. But sleep of such duration and scale was never meant to be perfect. The technology that sustained the Necrons in their crypts was the most advanced in the galaxy, but 60 million years is an eternity even for machines. Failures began to accumulate. Entire tomb worlds suffered catastrophic malfunctions. Some failed to wake when they should have, their inhabitants sleeping on while the galaxy they had meant to conquer drifted further from the age they remembered. Others woke too early, their resurrection protocols triggered by some random fluctuation in their systems or by disturbances on the worlds above them. Still others were destroyed entirely, their crypts collapsing or being invaded by younger races who had no idea what ancient power they were disturbing. The Great Awakening, when it finally began, was not the synchronized rise of a unified empire that the Silent King had envisioned. It was a scattered, chaotic affair, with tomb worlds waking at different times across thousands of years. Some Necrons opened their optical senses to find the great crusade of the Emperor of Mankind sweeping across the galaxy in the late 30th millennium. They witnessed space marine legions, thousands strong, conquering worlds in the name of a golden figure who commanded power beyond anything the Necrons had encountered among younger races. Other tomb worlds stirred during the Age of Apostasy in the 36th millennium, awakening to an Imperium tearing itself apart in religious civil war. Still others slept through all of this and only rose in the final years of the 41st millennium, when the galaxy had been split by the Great Rift and chaos threatened to consume all of reality. Each tomb world that woke found itself isolated, cut off from the empire it had once served, forced to navigate a galaxy that had utterly changed while it slept. To those Necrons who did wake during humanity's ascendance, the Imperium appeared as both familiar and alien. They recognized the patterns of empire building, the conquest of worlds, as the subjugation of alien species. These were things they themselves had done millions of years before, but the Imperium's foundation on faith, on worship of the Emperor as a god, on the channeling of psychic power through belief and prayer, all of this was utterly foreign to the Necron understanding. They looked upon the Astronomicon, that great psychic lighthouse that guided ships through the warp, and saw only waste, only the burning of souls to sustain a navigational aid, when technology could achieve the same result without such sacrifice. They observed space marines going into battle with prayers on their lips and faith in their hearts, and could not comprehend how such irrationality could produce such effective warriors. The Imperium, from a Necron perspective, was a civilization built on the very things they had learned to despise during the war in heaven: psychic power, warp manipulation, and the weakness of flesh. The Emperor, mystery incarnate. If the Necrons are defined by their ancient past and their transformation into unliving machines, the Emperor of mankind is defined by mystery itself. He is a being whose origins are shrouded in deliberate obscurity, whose true nature even his closest servants do not fully understand, whose plans span millennia, and whose power is beyond the comprehension of ordinary humans. To the Imperium, he is the God Emperor, the master of mankind, the Omnissiah incarnate. He sits upon the golden throne on Terra, barely alive, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers whose souls are fed to him to maintain his grip on existence. His consciousness spans the galaxy, guiding ships through the warp via the Astronomicon, protecting humanity from the predations of chaos gods, inspiring faith in billions of believers who have never seen his face but know his name with every fiber of their being. To those who study him from outside the Imperium's propaganda, he is something far more complex and far more terrifying. The Emperor's origins are a subject of endless speculation and conflicting accounts. According to some ancient sources, he was born in the 8th millennium before Christ, in the region of ancient Anatolia, created when hundreds or thousands of human shamans performed a mass ritual suicide, merging their souls in the warp to create a single being of immense psychic power. This reincarnated entity would walk among humanity for thousands of years, and guiding its development from the shadows, appearing at crucial moments in history as prophet, king, scientist, or warrior. Other accounts suggest different origins, that perhaps the Emperor was artificially created during the Dark Age of technology, a weapon designed by humanity's ancestors to protect their species from the threats that lurked in the warp and the darkness between stars. Still others hint that he might be something else entirely, perhaps an old one who survived the war in heaven, or a being from outside the galaxy who arrived during humanity's infancy and decided to guide its evolution. The truth, if such a thing even exists regarding the Emperor, has been lost to the ages, deliberately obscured even in the minds of those who might have once known it. What can be stated with certainty is that the Emperor is the most powerful human psyker ever to exist, a being whose connection to the warp is so profound that it transcends anything seen in other races, save perhaps the ancient Eldar gods before their fall. His psychic might allows him to reshape reality itself, to peer into possible futures and choose between divergent timelines, to project his consciousness across the galaxy, to create life from nothing and bind demons with a thought. During the Great Crusade, before his internment upon the Golden Throne, he walked among his space marine legions as a golden giant, whose very presence inspired worship in those who beheld him. He radiated power so intense that even those with no psychic sensitivity could feel it, a pressure in the air, as a light that seemed to shine from within rather than reflecting from without. His charisma was supernatural, his intelligence beyond genius, his strategic vision spanning not just battles or campaigns, but millennia of careful planning toward goals that only he fully understood. The Emperor's grand design, as much as it can be discerned from his actions, was nothing less than the elevation of humanity to become the dominant force in the galaxy. He foresaw a time when humanity would evolve into a fully psychic species, able to wield warp powers safely, protected from the predations of chaos by their own strength and unity. To achieve this vision, he needed to shepherd humanity through a dangerous transition period. The birth of Slaanesh and the resulting Age of Strife had plunged humanity into darkness, cutting off worlds from each other, allowing alien species to prey on isolated human colonies and giving chaos cultists free rein to spread their corruption. The Emperor emerged from his millennia-long watch in the shadows and took direct action. He conquered terror, uniting the techno-barbarian kingdoms under his rule through a combination of military might, political genius, and overwhelming psychic power. His created warriors, first the Thunder Warriors and later the Space Marines, were tools for this conquest, each one a work of genetic engineering that pushed the limits of what was possible. His creation of the Primarchs represented the pinnacle of his genetic craft. 20 demigods, each crafted to embody different aspects of warfare and leadership, been created through processes that blended science with warp-based manipulation in ways that even the greatest Mechanicum adepts could not fully comprehend. The Primarchs were to be his generals in the Great Crusade, leading the Space Marine legions that bore their genetic legacy to reconquer the galaxy for humanity. But the Chaos Gods, recognizing the threat the Emperor posed to their dominion, scattered the infant Primarchs across the galaxy through the warp, turning what should have been his greatest triumph into the seeds of his eventual downfall. The Emperor spent decades searching for his lost sons, finding them one by one on the worlds where they had been raised, and incorporating them into his grand plan. Under their leadership, the Great Crusade swept across the stars, bringing world after world into the Imperium's embrace, or crushing Xenos empires and reclaiming humanity's birthright among the stars. But the Emperor's plans contained fatal flaws, born from his own arrogance and his fundamental misunderstanding of the forces he sought to control. He believed that by denying the Chaos Gods their names, by forbidding knowledge of them to spread, by pretending they did not exist, he could starve them of the belief and worship that sustained them. He was wrong. His secrecy about the nature of the warp, his refusal to properly educate even his own sons about the true dangers that lurked in the Imperium, created a vacuum of knowledge that chaos rushed to fill. When Erebus and Corpharon began whispering corruption into Lorgar's ear, when Horus was shown the supposed future of the Imperium without his presence, when Magnus delved too deep into forbidden lore, seeking to perfect his psychic craft, they were vulnerable precisely because they did not understand what they were dealing with. The Horus heresy, the civil war that tore the Imperium apart and nearly destroyed humanity entirely, was in many ways the Emperor's failure to recognize that ignorance is not protection. The end of the heresy saw the Emperor mortally wounded by Horus, his favorite son, corrupted and empowered by all 4 Chaos Gods working in concert. The Emperor destroyed Horus utterly, erasing him from existence so completely that even his soul was annihilated. But the cost was terrible. The Emperor's body was broken beyond any hope of recovery. He was placed upon the Golden Throne as an ancient device from the dark age of technology that had been repurposed into a life support system of staggering complexity. There he has remained for 10,000 years, neither alive nor dead, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily, their souls consumed to maintain his fading consciousness. From the Golden Throne, he holds together the Astronomicon, that great psychic beacon that makes warp travel possible across the Imperium. He wages an eternal war against the Chaos Gods in the warp itself, preventing them from simply overrunning real space. He occasionally manifests miracles, sending visions to his faithful, empowering living saints, protecting his Imperium from threats it cannot perceive. But he cannot speak, cannot act directly, cannot guide his empire except through the most oblique and uncertain means. The Imperium that has grown in his name during these 10 millennia bears only passing resemblance to the secular empire of reason he tried to build. It has become a theocracy, worshipping him as a god, despite his own insistence during the Great Crusade that he was no deity. The ecclesiarchy, the vast religious organization dedicated to spreading the imperial creed, commands power and influence that rivals the military and political institutions of the Imperium. Trillions of human beings pray to the emperor daily, their faith feeding his power in the warp in ways he could never have anticipated. This belief, this worship, has transformed him from merely the most powerful human psyche into something approaching an actual god, a warp entity sustained by the collective faith of countless souls. The Chaos Gods call him the Anathema, for he represents everything they oppose, a being of order and purpose standing against the madness and entropy they embody. Whether he intended this transformation, or whether it was thrust upon him by the desperate faith of a dying species, the Emperor has become in death what he denied in life, a god. This, then, is what the Emperor was, and what he has become, a being of immense power, of mysterious origin, of grandiose plans that spanned millennia and ultimately failed in their original design, yet succeeded in creating an empire that has endured for 10,000 years of brutal conflict. A psyche of such might that his very existence shapes the warp around him, creating eddies and currents in the sea of souls that other entities must navigate around. A man who would be God, or a god who was once a man, or perhaps something altogether different that transcends such simple categories. And when the Necrons, ancient beings from before humanity's ancestors had crawled from the oceans of terror, encounter this golden sovereign and his empire of faith, they see him through lenses ground from experiences utterly alien to human understanding. The timeline problem. When worlds diverged. To grasp what the Necrons can and cannot know about the Emperor, we must confront a fundamental problem of timescale. The temporal gulf between the Necrons' history and the Emperor's existence is so vast that it defies human comprehension. When humans try to imagine deep time, we reach perhaps to the age of the Earth, 4.5 billion years, or to the extinction of the dinosaurs, 65 million years ago. These numbers are abstract and too large to truly feel in our bones, but they are the very landscape the Necrons traverse when they remember their past. The war in heaven, the conflict that defined their civilization and ultimately transformed them into the machines they became, occurred more than 60 million years ago.
You know, I find it absolutely fascinating how the Necrons and the Emperor represent two completely opposite philosophies about existence itself. The Necrons looked at their mortality and said, "We'll conquer death through technology," while the Emperor looked at humanity's potential and said, "We'll transcend through evolution and psychic power." Both paths led to a kind of immortality, but at what cost? The Necrons lost their souls and became machines. The Emperor became trapped on a throne, more symbol than man. It makes you wonder if either of them would make the same choice again, knowing what they know now. The Silent King certainly seems to have regrets, spending millions of years in exile trying to figure out how to undo what he did. And the Emperor, well, we'll never know what he thinks about becoming the very thing he told humanity not to worship. Sometimes the galaxy's greatest tragedies aren't written by villains, but by heroes who are just trying to save their people. But anyway, let's continue.
60 million years. To put that in perspective, 60 million years ago on Earth, the dinosaurs had just been wiped out by the asteroid impact at Chicxulub. The mammals that would eventually give rise to humanity's ancestors were small, rodent-like creatures hiding in burrows. The continents were still assembling into their current positions. The Rocky Mountains were young, the Himalayas did not yet exist, and the Atlantic Ocean was narrower than it is today. In the time since the Necrons entered their great sleep, entire geological epochs have come and gone on Terra. Species have evolved, radiated into 1,000 forms, and gone extinct without leaving a trace. The stars in Earth's night sky have moved noticeably in their slow dance across the celestial sphere. Tectonic forces have reshaped continents. Ice ages have come and gone multiple times. And through all of this, through all these unimaginable stretches of time, the Necrons slept, their consciousness suspended in perfect stasis, waiting for the galaxy to calm enough for them to claim their dominion. When they finally began to wake, the universe they remembered existed only in their fragmented memories. Every race they had known was either extinct or transformed beyond recognition. The old ones were gone, destroyed in the war in heaven. The Eldar, who had been powerful even then, they had risen to heights of civilization that made their ancestors look primitive, only to nearly destroy themselves through their own decadence, birthing Slanesh and shattering their empire. The greenskins that once were mighty Krork had devolved into the savage hordes that plagued the galaxy. And everywhere, on worlds the Necrons had once ruled, were new species, younger races who had evolved in the void left by the Necrons' absence. Chief among these young upstarts was humanity. When the first Necron tomb worlds began to stir in the late 30th millennium, humanity had existed in its current form for perhaps 200,000 years. Recorded human history, the stories written down and preserved, stretched back perhaps 10,000 years at most. The Emperor himself, ancient as he was by human standards, what had lived for perhaps 30,000 years, if the most generous estimates of his age are to be believed. 30,000 years is an eye blink to the Necrons. It is less than 1/20th of 1% of the time they had slept. If we compress the Necrons' sleep into a human year, the Emperor's entire lifetime would represent less than 5 hours. He would be an infant, barely born, certainly not someone whose significance could be assessed in any meaningful way. And humanity? Humanity would have appeared approximately 48 hours before the Necrons woke. A species that had gone from stone tools to starships in the last moment before their eyes opened. This temporal disconnect creates fundamental problems for Necron knowledge of the Emperor. They have no frame of reference for him. Their experiences, their memories, their understanding of how the galaxy works, all of it was forged millions of years before the Emperor drew his first breath. When they think of threats, of powers that must be measured and assessed, they think in terms of the Old Ones, beings who had lived for millions of years and commanded forces that shaped the galaxy itself. They think of the Setan, star gods whose existence spanned the lifetime of the universe. Against such entities, what is a being who has lived for a mere 30,000 years? What significance can he possibly hold? How can someone so young in cosmic terms command respect from minds that remember epochs that predate him by such vast margins? The Necrons' entire perspective is skewed by the weight of their history. They have seen empires rise and fall, watched species evolve and go extinct, or witnessed the birth and death of stars. The Emperor is a newcomer, an upstart, barely worth noticing in the grand scheme of their experience, yet notice him they must, for the galaxy they have awakened to is dominated by his creation. The Imperium of man sprawls across 1,000,000 worlds. Its military might, backed by numbers that even the Necrons at their height would have struggled to match. Humanity's presence is unavoidable. Their ships crisscross the galaxy. Their settlements have spread to worlds that once belonged to the Necrons. Their Adeptus Mechanicus scavenge technology from tomb worlds without understanding what they touch. The Necrons cannot ignore humanity, even if they wanted to, and at the center of this vast human empire stands the Emperor, a psychic titan whose power resonates through the warp in ways that even the Necrons, blind to the Imperium as they are, cannot help but notice through its effects on real space. This creates a paradox for the Necrons. On one hand, the Emperor should be insignificant, a mayfly creature whose brief existence is hardly worth acknowledging. On the other hand, he has achieved in 30,000 years what should have taken millions, uniting humanity under a single banner, creating space marines who can stand against threats that would annihilate lesser warriors, establishing an empire that has endured for 10,000 years after his effective death. The timeline problem extends to the question of what information the Necrons could have gathered. Those tomb worlds that woke during the Great Crusade would have had the opportunity to observe the Emperor directly, to witness his power as he led his legions across the stars. But how many Necrons actually had such encounters? The Great Crusade lasted only 200 years before the Horus heresy tore it apart. In that time, the Emperor and his forces certainly encountered some awakening Necrons, but the vast majority of tomb worlds remained dormant. Those that did wake often found themselves immediately under assault by Imperial forces, who saw only Xenos threats to be eliminated, not ancient civilizations worthy of study. Combat provides poor opportunities for careful observation and analysis. When you're fighting for survival against space marines, when your warriors are being torn apart by bolter fire and your crypts are being targeted by orbital bombardment, there's little chance to catalogue the psychic signature of the Golden Warlord commanding these armies. Any knowledge gained would be fragmentary at best, conclusions drawn from battle reports and intercepted communications rather than from systematic study. And then there's the question of memory itself. The Necrons are not immune to the ravages of time, even in their machine bodies. 60 million years of stasis has taken its toll. Many Necrons woke with their consciousness damaged, their memories fragmented, their cognitive processes impaired by cascade failures in their engram patterns. The lowliest warriors have almost no memory of their former lives, reduced to programmed automatons following simple instructions. Even the nobility, who retained more of their minds, often find their recollections of the time before the Great Sleep hazy and uncertain. They remember the war in heaven in broad strokes but struggle with specific details. Or they know they once fought the old ones, but cannot always recall individual battles or specific victories. In this context, memories of encounters with the Emperor, recent as they are in cosmic terms, might be lost in the noise of damaged neural architectures struggling to maintain coherence across millions of years. A Necron overlord who witnessed the Great Crusade might remember the general fact of human expansion, but forget the specific details of the golden figure who commanded it, their observations buried under the weight of more ancient and more traumatic memories. The Void Dragon, a crucial connection. If we seek concrete, verifiable knowledge that the Necrons possess about the Emperor, we must turn to perhaps the most significant connection between these two forces, the Citan shard known as the Void Dragon, imprisoned beneath the surface of Mars for over 1,000 years before the Emperor's rise to galactic prominence. This connection represents the clearest evidence we have of direct interaction between the Emperor and forces related to the Necrons, though the full implications of this encounter remain shrouded in mystery and speculation. The story of the Void Dragon begins not in the current millennium, but in the depths of Earth's history, in a time before the Age of Strife, when the Emperor walked among humanity as one of many figures, guiding their development from the shadows. According to fragmentary accounts preserved by the Guardians of the Dragon, entities chosen by the Emperor to watch over the imprisoned Citan, the dragon lived in space between the stars, feeding on stellar energy, as all Citan do. At some point, and for reasons that remain unclear, this shard of the Void Dragon fled to Terra, possibly seeking to hide from other Citan or from the Necrons during their rebellion against their former masters. The memories of the dragon itself, accessed through the psychic impressions it leaves on its guardians, suggest that it waged war against its own kind, battles that left it weakened and desperate. Terra, rich with life and situated far from the major conflicts that raged across the galaxy, would have seemed like an ideal refuge. There, it could rest, recover, and perhaps feed on the abundant biological energy of Earth's teeming ecosystems. But it did not account for the presence of a psychic entity of unprecedented power, one who recognized the danger the Citan represented and moved to neutralize it: the Emperor. At some point in Earth's history, variously placed between the 3rd and 12th centuries of the first millennium, confronted the Void Dragon. The memories preserved by the Guardians describe a titanic battle between a lone warrior knight in golden armor, bearing a silver lance and riding a black charger, against a monstrous entity that was half reptilian beast and half bird of prey, with scales that shone like liquid mercury and eyes that burned with the light of devoured stars. This battle, possibly the origin of the legend of St. George and the dragon in human mythology, ended not with the dragon's death, but with its imprisonment. The Emperor discovered, as the Necrons had discovered millions of years before, that the Khitan cannot truly be destroyed. They are too fundamental to reality itself, as too interwoven with the fabric of the material universe. But what cannot be destroyed can be bound, and the Emperor possessed knowledge and power sufficient to create chains that even a Khitan shard could not break. Whether he drew this knowledge from his own understanding of the deep structure of reality, or whether he had access to Old One technologies that specialized in containing such beings, remains unknown. What matters is that he succeeded. The dragon was imprisoned, bound in a prison constructed from psychic energies that the creature had no defense against. Khitan exist purely in the material realm, masters of physics and technology, but utterly blind to the warp. The Emperor, the most powerful psyker humanity would ever produce, used precisely the weapon that the Khitan were most vulnerable to, warp-based power, shaped with precision and maintained through constant vigilance. But the Emperor did not simply imprison the dragon and forget about it. He transported this imprisoned shard across space to Mars, the red planet that would become the heart of humanity's technological civilization. This decision was not random. The Emperor, whose plans extended across millennia, and whose understanding of causality allowed him to see branching futures and select between them, knew what he was doing. He understood that the Void Dragon, even imprisoned, would leak its influence into the surrounding environment. The Khitan was known as Magladroth in Necron mythology, the master of the material realm, the Khitan whose understanding of technology and mastery over matter was unmatched among even the star gods. The knowledge contained within even a shard of such a being was profound beyond measuring. By placing this shard beneath Mars, the Emperor ensured that the human colonists who settled the Red Planet would be subtly influenced by its presence. Their dreams would be touched by visions of machines and technology. Their natural aptitude for engineering would be enhanced by the dragon's leaking consciousness. Over centuries and millennia, this influence would shape the culture of Mars into something unique within human civilization, a techno-theocracy that worshipped the machine god and possessed understanding of technology that exceeded even the greatest achievements of other human worlds. When the Emperor finally revealed himself during the Unification Wars and began building his Imperium, he needed allies with technological expertise. Yet he needed forge worlds that could produce the weapons, armor, ships, and equipment his great crusade would require. The Mechanicum of Mars, shaped by millennia of exposure to the Void Dragon's influence, was perfectly positioned to fill this role. They possessed knowledge of technologies that had been lost elsewhere during the Age of Strife. They maintained ancient STC templates and knew how to manufacture weapons that other humans had forgotten. Their worship of the machine god, while technically forbidden under the Emperor's imperial truth that denied the existence of gods, was tolerated because the Emperor could not afford to antagonize such crucial allies. He claimed to be the Omnissiah, the machine god's prophet, and the Mechanicum, recognizing in him a being of immense power who understood technology at levels that matched their own deepest mysteries, accepted this claim and joined his Imperium. Whether they understood that their machine god was in fact a Khitan shard, whether the highest ranks of the Mechanicum knew the truth about what slept beneath their forges, is a question that even now has no clear answer. But the Emperor knew, and he had planned for this, had arranged the pieces on the board millions of years in advance. This means that when we ask what the Necrons know about the Emperor, we must consider what the Khitan shard imprisoned on Mars might know. and what information that shard might have conveyed to Necrons who sought to retrieve it. In the year 998 of the 41st millennium, 5 Necron Shroud-class light cruisers penetrated Mars's orbital defenses in a suicide run. These vessels, cloaked and moving with single-minded purpose, landed near the Noctis Labyrinthus, the very location where the Void Dragon was believed to be imprisoned. The Necrons made no attempt to invade the wider planet, showed no interest in conquering Mars or destroying its forges. They had one goal, and they pursued it with the characteristic focus of their kind. What happened during this incursion remains classified at the highest levels of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but the fact of the attack itself is known. Necrons do not waste resources on pointless gestures. They do not send ships on suicide missions for no reason. The logical conclusion is that they were attempting to reach the Void Dragon, either to free it or to communicate with it, or perhaps simply to verify its presence. If the Necrons succeeded in making contact with the Void Dragon Shard, even briefly, they would have learned much. A Citan, even a Shard, even imprisoned, retains immense knowledge. Magaladroth would remember the Emperor's power, would have assessed his capabilities during their battle, would have experienced firsthand what it meant to be defeated by warp-based weapons wielded with the skill and might of the greatest human psyker. The Citan would know that the Emperor possessed understanding of forces that the Necrons themselves cannot touch, that he could bind even a star god with chains of psychic energy. It would know that the Emperor had foresight, had planned centuries ahead, that had manipulated causality itself to ensure that humanity developed the technological base it would need. And if the Necrons extracted this information from the Void Dragon, if they were able to download or otherwise access the Shard's memories, they would possess intelligence on the Emperor that surpasses anything they could have learned through direct observation of the Imperium. But here, we must be careful not to overstate what even this information would mean. Knowledge of the Emperor's power does not equal understanding of his nature. The Citan, beings of the material realm, have always struggled to comprehend warp-based phenomena. They recognize its power, fear its potential to harm them, seek to nullify it through technology like the Blackstone pylons. But they do not truly understand it the way the Old Ones did. The way the Eldar do, the way even human psychers in their limited fashion can grasp. The Void Dragon might know that the Emperor defeated it through psychic might have catalogued the specific techniques and effects employed, but it would still view all of this through the lens of its own material realm consciousness. It would see the Emperor as a powerful psyker, certainly, perhaps the most powerful it had ever encountered. But would it grasp the Emperor's significance as a figure of faith, as a being whose power is sustained by the worship of trillions? Would it understand the Emperor's transformation from man into something approaching godhood through the collective belief of humanity? These are subtleties that even the wisest Citan might miss, for they require understanding the interplay between the warp and real space, between belief and reality, between consciousness and its manifestation in the immaterium. What the Silent King knows. Among all the Necrons, one figure stands apart in terms of the knowledge he might possess about the Emperor: Sarek, the Silent King, last ruler of the unified Necron Empire. Unlike other Necrons who slept through the millennia and awoke with fragmented memories and limited context, the Silent King chose a different path. After ordering his people into their great sleep, after destroying the command protocols that gave him absolute control over the Necron race, Sarek exiled himself from the galaxy entirely. He departed in a massive planet-sized sepulchral engine, taking with him legions of his own Sarek dynasty, and journeyed into the intergalactic void. There, in the vast emptiness between galaxies, he wandered for millions of years, the only Necron who retained complete memories of his former organic existence, who could remember what it felt like to be Necrontyr, who bore the full weight of guilt for what he had done to his people. This solitary exile, terrible as it was, meant that the Silent King's consciousness never degraded the way other Necrons did during the Great Sleep. His mind remained active, processing, remembering, planning for the day when he might return and find some way to undo the curse of biotransference. During his long wandering, Zarek maintained perfect recall of everything he had experienced. He remembered the war in heaven in complete detail, recalled every strategy employed against the Old Ones, every battle fought against the Satan, but more relevantly to our question. And he was fully conscious and aware when he finally decided to return to the galaxy. That return came in the mid-41st millennium, specifically in the year 744, when the Silent King encountered something in the void that sent him racing back to the galaxy he had left behind. That something was the Tyranids, the Great Devourer, a hive mind of such magnitude and hunger that it threatened to consume all biomass in the galaxy. The Silent King recognized immediately the threat this represented. His long-term plan, developed over millions of years of exile, was to find some way to reverse biotransference, to restore his people to organic bodies with souls that could once again touch the warp. But if the Tyranids succeeded, if they devoured all organic life in the galaxy, there would be no biomass available for such a transformation. The Necrons would be trapped in their machine bodies forever. When the Silent King returned, he found a galaxy vastly different from the one he had left. The Imperium of Man dominated a significant portion of the galaxy, its million worlds connected by the Astronomicon and defended by armies that numbered in the trillions. The Silent King, with his unimpaired faculties and his strategic genius honed over eons of warfare, immediately began assessing this new power and its mysterious leader. He would have studied everything his scouts could gather about the Imperium's structure, its strengths and weaknesses, its founding myths and current state. He would have learned about the Emperor, about the Great Crusade, about the Horus Heresy and its aftermath. It's about the Emperor's current state upon the Golden Throne. He would have pieced together from intercepted transmissions, from interrogations of captured humans, from analysis of Imperial tactics and strategies, a comprehensive picture of humanity's sovereign and what he represented. And what the Silent King would have concluded from this analysis offers us perhaps the clearest window into what the Necrons understand about the Emperor. Most telling is an incident that occurred when the Silent King encountered Dante, chapter master of the Blood Angels, during a battle against Tyranid forces. These two ancient warriors, one organic and one machine, stood together against the swarm that threatened to consume all life. After the battle, in a rare moment of direct communication, yet the Silent King did something extraordinary. He wore a golden death mask in honor of Sanguinius, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, one of the Emperor's sons. He claimed to have known Sanguinius, to have recognized the nobility and tragedy inherent in that particular Primarch. This statement, this gesture, reveals layers of knowledge that we must carefully unpack. For the Silent King to know Sanguinius, he would have needed to encounter him during the Great Crusade, before the Primarch's death during the Horus Heresy in the 31st millennium. This means the Silent King was already present in the galaxy, already observing and perhaps interacting with Imperial forces, far earlier than most historical accounts would suggest. His exile was not absolute. He returned, at least briefly, to witness the Emperor's empire at its height. What did the Silent King observe during these encounters? What conclusions did he draw about the Emperor and his sons? The fact that he honored Sanguinius specifically, that he recognized the tragedy of that Primarch's fate, suggests understanding that goes beyond mere tactical assessment. The Silent King saw something in Sanguinius that resonated even with his machine consciousness, some quality of nobility mixed with doom that perhaps reminded him of his own situation, a leader who sacrificed everything for his people, who was destroyed by his attempts to protect them. The Silent King, more than any other Necron, would understand that particular form of tragedy. But more than this, the Silent King would have recognized the Emperor's strategic brilliance in creating the Primarchs at all. These were beings designed to lead humanity's expansion, each one crafted to excel in specific aspects of warfare and governance. The Emperor had created the Primarchs through a combination of genetic engineering and warp manipulation. techniques that the Necrons could appreciate, even if they could never replicate the psychic components. The Silent King would have seen in the Primarch project echoes of his own civilization's attempts to transcend their limitations, to become more than what natural evolution had made them. The Silent King's knowledge of the Emperor would also be informed by his understanding of the Imperium's current state. He returned to find the Emperor effectively dead, trapped upon the Golden Throne, unable to act directly, ruling only through the faith of his followers and the occasional miracle manifested through immense psychic effort. The Silent King would have noted the irony. The Emperor, who fought so hard to unite humanity under the banner of reason and technology, had become a god worshipped by an empire that had rejected almost everything he stood for during his active life. The imperial truth, the Emperor's insistence that there were no gods, and that humanity must rely on science rather than superstition, had been replaced by the imperial creed, a faith so fervent that it powered the Emperor's continued existence in the warp. The Silent King, who himself had made terrible bargains and seen them twist into outcomes he never intended, would recognize this pattern. He would understand, perhaps better than any human could, the weight of unintended consequences, the way even the most carefully laid plans can transform into something monstrous. But the Silent King's knowledge extends beyond historical observation. He is actively engaged with the Imperium in the current era, most notably through his construction of the Pariah Nexus, a vast network of blackstone pylons designed to cut off the warp from real space across entire sectors of the galaxy. This project reveals sophisticated understanding of the Imperium's dependencies and vulnerabilities. The Silent King knows that the Imperium relies on warp travel, that the Astronomicon guides their ships, that psychers are essential to their military and administrative functions. He knows that by creating zones where the warp is becalmed, where psychic powers fail and warp entities cannot manifest, he can cripple Imperial forces and render their most powerful weapons useless. He has observed that within these null zones, humans suffer from a malady called the stilling, a lethargy and loss of purpose that seems to stem from their souls being cut off from the warp. This knowledge is not abstract. It's practical, actionable, the kind of intelligence that can only come from extensive study and experimentation. Moreover, the Silent King's plans for reverse biotransference reveal something crucial about what he knows regarding the Emperor and humanity's nature. The Silent King seeks to restore Necrons to organic bodies, to reclaim the souls that were stolen during biotransference. To do this, he needs suitable organic vessels, bodies that can house Necron consciousnesses. Humans, with their relatively weak connection to the warp compared to species like the Eldar, represent potential candidates for this process. But the Silent King's interest in humanity is more subtle than simple harvest. He has ordered his overlords to preserve human life where possible within the Pariah Nexus, ostensibly for use as labor, though this explanation makes little tactical sense given the Necrons' vast numbers of automated workers. Some scholars believe this is actually a cover, that the Silent King is attempting to convince his more xenophobic subjects to spare humans for eventual biotransference experiments. If this is true, it means the Silent King has made sophisticated assessments of human biology, psychology, and spiritual nature, understanding them well enough to consider them viable hosts for Necron minds. And the Silent King's encounters with Belisarius Cawl and the Imperium's forces during the battles for the Pariah Nexus would have provided further intelligence. Cawl himself represents a fascinating subject of study, an archmagos who has lived for 10,000 years through prohibited technologies, who understands Necron science well enough to attempt replicating their pylon technology, who seeks to harness Blackstone for his own purposes. The Silent King would have analyzed Cawl's capabilities, his knowledge, his goals, and through him gained further insight into the Mechanicum's relationship to the Emperor and to the Satan Shard imprisoned on Mars. He would understand that humanity, despite its apparent technological regression from the heights of the Dark Age of technology, thus still possesses pockets of knowledge and expertise that can pose genuine threats to Necron plans. This understanding would naturally extend to the Emperor himself, a being who created the Mechanicum's alliance, who understood technology deeply enough to craft the Primarchs and the Space Marines, whose plans encompassed millennia of development across countless fields of science and engineering. Yet for all this knowledge, there remain fundamental things the Silent King cannot know. He cannot know what it feels like to experience the Emperor's presence through faith, to have one's soul touched by the light of the Astronomicon, to be inspired to impossible acts of courage by belief in the God Emperor's protection. These are experiential realities that the Necrons, severed from the warp, can never understand. What the Silent King can observe their effects, can measure the morale boost that faith provides to Imperial troops, can calculate the strategic advantage of religious fervor, but he cannot feel what drives that faith, cannot comprehend from the inside what it means to believe in something beyond measurable reality. This represents perhaps the most significant limitation on Necron knowledge of the Emperor. They can know what he does and has done, but they cannot truly grasp what he is, for so much of what he is exists in the realm of faith and belief that remains forever closed to them. Necron. Perspective on Psychers and the Warp. To understand how the Necrons view the Emperor, we must first understand how they view Psychers and the Warp itself, for the Emperor is first and foremost the greatest human Psyker to ever exist. The Necron perspective on psychic power is shaped by experiences that predate humanity's evolution by tens of millions of years. During the War in Heaven, when the Necron were still beings of flesh and blood, they possessed no psychic abilities themselves. They were a purely material species, talented in technology and engineering, but utterly blind to the warp. This proved to be a decisive disadvantage when they went to war against the Old Ones, whose mastery of the Imperium allowed them to create warrior races specifically designed to wield warp power. The Old Ones raised up the Eldar, gifted them with immense psychic potential, and set them loose against Necron forces that had no defense against such abilities. They engineered the Krork, the ancestors of modern greenskins, whose collective psychic field made them nearly unstoppable in massed combat. They deployed countless other Psyker races, each one a weapon specifically crafted to exploit the Necrontyrs' blindness to the warp. The Necrontyr learned to hate the warp with a passion that transcended mere tactical frustration. They saw it as fundamentally unfair, a cheat in the game of existence, a dimension that allowed their enemies to ignore the laws of physics that governed everything else. A Necrontyr warrior could train for decades, master every fighting technique, perfect every tactical maneuver, only to be destroyed by an Eldar who simply willed them to cease existing. Necrontyr warships could be designed with perfect engineering, their weapons precisely calibrated, their armor mathematically optimized, and yet be torn apart by warp storms or psychic assaults that bypassed all their defenses. How could any civilization compete when their enemies could reach into another dimension and pull out power that violated causality itself? The Necrontyr directed much of their prodigious scientific talent toward finding ways to counter psychic abilities. They developed weapons that could disrupt warp energies, technologies that could create dead zones where psychic powers failed, and when they allied with the Citan and underwent biotransference, one of the benefits was that their machine bodies were utterly severed from the warp, making them immune to many psychic attacks that relied on affecting organic minds or souls. But immunity to direct psychic assault does not equal immunity to the warp's effects, and the Necrons discovered this during the latter stages of the War in Heaven, when their victory over the Old Ones had unintended consequences. The immense violence of the conflict, the deaths of countless trillions of psychically sensitive beings, the suffering and terror of entire civilizations, all of this fed the warp, transforming it from a relatively calm dimension into a roiling sea of madness. The enslavers emerged from the warp, beings that could possess and control psychic species, turning them into gates through which more enslavers could enter real space. These entities didn't need to attack the Necrons directly to threaten them. They simply consumed the Necrons' enemies and potential servants, depopulating the galaxy and making it impossible for the Necrons to rule over anything, even if they won the war. The Necrons' response to this crisis was to develop technologies that could calm the warp, that could create barriers between real space and the Imperium. The Blackstone pylons, ancient constructions found on worlds like Cadia, represent this technology. They use negatively charged noctilith, a material that resonates with the warp in ways that dampen its energies, creating zones of stability where warp storms cannot reach, and psychic powers are significantly weakened. When the Necrons entered their great sleep, they did so partly to wait out the warp storms and demonic incursions that plagued the galaxy in the aftermath of the war in heaven. They believed that in time, with the psychic races dead or weakened, the warp would calm and they could safely emerge to claim their dominion. What they found when they awakened was almost the opposite. The warp was more turbulent than ever. New powers had arisen within it, the Chaos Gods, beings of such immense power that they rivaled or exceeded the Satan themselves. Psykers had not declined but proliferated, with humanity producing them in numbers that increased with each passing generation. The entire galaxy seemed to have embraced the very thing the Necrons hated most, making psychic ability central to civilization rather than an aberration to be eliminated. From the Necron perspective, this represents a fundamental failure of the galaxy to learn from history. They fought the war in heaven partly to prove that physical law and scientific principle were superior to warp-based power. They won that war, destroyed the old ones, shattered the Satan, and demonstrated that material reality could triumph over immaterial chaos. Yet here they find a galaxy that has seemingly learned nothing, that continues to rely on the warp, that builds civilizations on foundations of psychic power that could collapse at any moment. The Emperor, from this perspective, embodies everything the Necrons despise and fear about the warp. He is a psyker of unprecedented power, a being whose very existence warps reality around him, whose consciousness touches the Immaterium in ways that even the ancient Eldar would struggle to match. He sustains the Astronomicon, a psychic beacon so bright it can be seen across the entire galaxy by those with warp sight, burning the souls of thousands of psykers every day just to maintain its light. He wages eternal war in the warp itself, yet battling chaos gods in their own realm, playing their games even as he pretends to oppose them. To the Necrons, this looks like madness, like a civilization deliberately building its infrastructure on quicksand and being surprised when everything starts to sink. They would look at the Emperor's reliance on psychic power, his creation of psychic space marines, his use of navigators and astropaths, his acceptance of battle psykers and librarians, and see nothing but vulnerability. Every psyker is a potential gateway to the warp, a crack through which demons might pour. Every use of psychic power strengthens the Chaos Gods, feeding them energy that makes them more powerful. The Emperor's strategy, from a Necron viewpoint, is self-defeating even when it succeeds. But the Necrons would also recognize, grudgingly perhaps, that the Emperor's mastery of psychic power has proven devastatingly effective. The fact that he defeated a Citan shard, even a weakened one, using purely warp-based weapons, would be noted and filed away as crucial intelligence. The Satan were supposed to be the ultimate weapons against the warp, beings of pure material reality who could resist and counter psychic attacks through their fundamental nature. If a human psyker, no matter how powerful, could imprison such a being, then the Necrons' assumptions about warp users being inherently weak might need revision. The Emperor represents an anomaly, a psyker who has achieved what should be impossible. He has maintained his sanity and purpose for tens of thousands of years, far longer than most psykers survive, or while wielding power that should have attracted demonic corruption from the moment he first manifested his abilities. The Necrons would have difficulty explaining this. Their models of how the warp works would predict that someone of the Emperor's power should have been consumed by chaos long ago, should have become a puppet of the Chaos Gods, or been destroyed by the forces he wielded. Yet he endures, diminished perhaps but still present, still fighting, still maintaining some measure of control. This would lead to interesting strategic calculations. If the Necrons were to target the Emperor directly, if they attempted to destroy him or sever his connection to the Astronomicon, what would be the result? On one level, it would cripple the Imperium, leaving humanity blind in the warp, or unable to navigate except through the most dangerous and desperate means. The Imperium would fragment as worlds lost contact with Terra, as the Administratum could no longer coordinate across the vast distances of galactic space. This would seem to serve Necron interests, weakening one of the major powers in the galaxy and creating opportunities for Necron expansion. But on another level, destroying the Emperor might trigger catastrophes that would threaten the Necrons themselves. The Emperor currently acts as a bulwark against full-scale warp incursions, holding back the Chaos Gods through his constant battles in the Imperium. If he falls, if that resistance ceases, the warp might overflow into real space on a scale that makes the current state of the galaxy look stable by comparison. The Great Rift, as the cicatrix maledictum that currently splits the galaxy in half, might expand. Demon worlds might multiply. Warp storms might engulf systems by the thousand. And while the Necrons are immune to demonic corruption, they are not immune to the physical effects of warp incursions, the reality warping phenomena that make stable existence impossible. The Necrons, then, find themselves in a strange position regarding the Emperor. They hate what he represents, despise the foundation of psychic power upon which the Imperium is built, view the entire human approach to the warp as dangerously naive. Yet, they cannot simply eliminate him without risk of making their own situation worse. This creates a complex strategic environment where the Necrons must carefully calibrate their response to Imperial expansion, as must balance their desire to reclaim tomb worlds against the potential destabilization that open war with the Imperium might cause. The Silent King's Pariah Nexus represents one approach to this problem. Rather than attacking the Emperor directly, create zones where psychic power fails, where the Imperium's dependence on the warp becomes a crippling weakness. This way, the Necrons can expand their territory, reclaim their lost empire, without triggering the catastrophic collapse that the Emperor's death might cause. It's a patient strategy, one that thinks in terms of centuries rather than years, perfectly suited to beings who have already waited 60 million years and can afford to wait longer if necessary. The Pariah Nexus Revelation. The Pariah Nexus, also known to the Necrons as the Contra-Empiric Nexus, represents perhaps the clearest window into current Necron understanding of the Emperor and the Imperium he created. This massive construct, centered in the Nephilim sector, consists of a vast network of blackstone pylons, arranged in patterns of what Imperial observers have described as non-Euclidean fractal cryptologic, geometric configurations so complex that human minds struggle to comprehend them fully. These pylons work in concert to create an anti-psychic field of unprecedented scale, a zone of space where the warp is becalmed, where its energies are dampened to the point of near non-existence. Within this zone, psychic powers fail or operate at drastically reduced strength. Demons find themselves trapped as if in amber, and warp travel becomes nearly impossible. But more than this, the Pariah Nexus affects living beings themselves, inducing a condition that Imperial forces have named the stilling, a progressive loss of vitality and will that seems to stem from souls being cut off from their natural connection to the warp. Humans within the Pariah Nexus gradually lose their motivation, their creativity, their very essence of what makes them human, becoming hollow shells going through the motions of existence. The creation of the Pariah Nexus was overseen by the Silent King himself, in concert with Cryptex Xeras and the forces of the Nihilak dynasty. This level of coordination, bringing together multiple Necron dynasties in service of a single grand design, speaks to how seriously the Necrons take the threat posed by warp-dependent civilizations. The resources committed to this project are staggering. Our millions of pylons had to be manufactured, transported to target worlds, and activated in precise sequence. Entire Necron fleets were dedicated to protecting the pylon networks from Imperial counterattacks. Cryptechs spent decades or longer calculating the exact positions and configurations needed to create the desired effect. This is not a hasty response or a desperate gambit. This is the kind of careful, methodical engineering project that the Necrons excel at, the application of science and technology on a scale that younger races can barely imagine, all directed toward a single purpose: neutralizing the advantage that psychic powers give to the Imperium and other warp-dependent species. The fact that the Necrons have invested so heavily in this project reveals how much they understand about the Imperium's structural vulnerabilities and how those vulnerabilities relate to the Emperor. The Pariah Nexus demonstrates sophisticated knowledge of the Imperium's dependencies. The Necrons understand that human civilization relies on the Astronomicon for long-range navigation, that without it, warp travel becomes exponentially more dangerous and uncertain. They know that psychers are essential to Imperial administration, that astropaths carry messages across the void, that the Adeptus Astra Telepathica trains sanctioned psychers for military service, that navigators guide ships through the warp using their third eye. They have observed that the Space Marines deploy librarians as force multipliers in battle, that the Inquisition employs psychers to hunt corruption and heresy, that even the Administratum relies on psychically enabled communication to coordinate the vast bureaucracy that governs a million worlds. All of these systems fail or falter within the Pariah Nexus. Messages cannot be sent psychically. Navigators lose their ability to see the currents of the warp. Librarians find their powers reduced to impotent gestures. The entire intricate web of psychic infrastructure that holds the Imperium together begins to unravel. This is not coincidental. The Necrons have studied the Imperium and identified precisely where to strike to cause maximum disruption. But the Pariah Nexus reveals more than just tactical awareness. It demonstrates that the Necrons understand the deeper relationship between humanity and the warp, and between consciousness and its reflection in the immaterium. The stilling effect, the gradual deterioration of human will and vitality within the null zones, shows that the Necrons know humans need their connection to the warp to function properly. This is a profound insight, one that goes beyond surface-level observation. Most species in the galaxy have at least some connection to the warp, however tenuous. Their souls, their consciousness, their very essence of being, all of this exists partly in real space and partly in the immaterium. Sever that connection too completely, and you don't just remove psychic abilities, you remove something fundamental to existence itself. The Necrons learned this the hard way, during their own biotransference, when their souls were burned away and they discovered that without that warp connection, they had lost something irreplaceable. Now they're using that knowledge as a weapon, creating zones where other species will suffer, as the Necrons suffer, where they will experience the emptiness of existence without souls. The Silent King's orders to his forces within the Pariah Nexus add another layer of complexity to our understanding of Necron knowledge. He has instructed Necron overlords to preserve human life where possible, to take prisoners rather than simply exterminating all resistance. The stated reason is to use humans as labor, but this explanation is transparently false to anyone who understands Necron capabilities. The Necrons have endless numbers of automaton workers, canoptech spiders, and scarabs that can perform labor more efficiently than any human ever could, without need for food, rest, or motivation. They have no practical need for human slaves, no economic incentive that would justify the resources required to maintain a population of biological beings. Yet the Silent King continues to push for human preservation, going so far as to make it official policy. The only logical explanation, the conclusion that many Imperial strategists have reached, is that the Silent King wants humans alive because he needs organic bodies for his biotransference experiments. He seeks to restore Necrons to flesh, and humans represent potential vessels for this transformation. This reveals that the Silent King has assessed humanity not just as an enemy to be defeated, but as a resource to be exploited. And more than that, as beings who possess something the Necrons desperately want: biological existence with minimal warp connection. Humans, and compared to species like the Eldar, have relatively weak psychic potential on average. Most humans are not psychers, and even those who are tend to have powers that pale next to what the Eldar routinely achieve. But they still have souls, still maintain connection to the warp, still experience the fullness of biological existence. From the Silent King's perspective, this makes them ideal candidates. They're not so psychically powerful that their bodies would be unsuitable for Necron consciousness, but they're not blanks either, those rare individuals with no warp presence at all. They represent a middle ground, a potential solution to the curse of biotransference. If the Silent King can figure out how to transfer Necron consciousness into human bodies while preserving both the Necron's memories and the body's warp connection, then he might achieve what he's sought for millions of years: restoration of what was lost when his people entered the furnaces all those eons ago. But this plan reveals a fundamental limitation in Necron understanding, a blind spot that stems from their own severing from the warp. The Silent King believes that reverse biotransference is primarily a technical problem, a matter of finding the right organic vessels and the right transfer procedures. He thinks like an engineer, like a scientist, approaching the problem as if it's a puzzle to be solved through sufficient application of technology and knowledge. What he may not fully grasp is that the soul is not simply data to be copied and transferred. It's not a program that can be installed in a new body. The connection between consciousness and warp presence, between self and soul, what is deeper and stranger than anything that can be reduced to mechanical process. The Necrons lost their souls during biotransference, not because the technology failed, but because that's what the process inherently did. The Satan consumed those souls, burning them as fuel. There's nothing left to restore, no backup copy waiting to be reintegrated. The Necrons who exist now are not beings who are missing their souls. They are beings whose consciousness was preserved when their souls were destroyed, running on neural architectures made of living metal rather than organic neural tissue. If the Silent King understood the Emperor's nature more deeply, if he could grasp what it means to be a being sustained by faith, by the belief of trillions channeling warp energy into a single consciousness, he might realize that his plan for reverse biotransference is fundamentally flawed. The Emperor's power comes not just from his own immense psychic talent, but from his connection to humanity's collective faith, from his transformation over 10,000 years from man into something approaching a warp god. This is not something that can be reverse engineered through sufficiently advanced technology. It's a mystery that touches on the deepest nature of consciousness, reality, and the warp itself. The Silent King, brilliant as he is, approaches this mystery from a perspective that makes it impossible for him to truly understand what he's dealing with. He can observe the effects of faith, can measure the power that flows through the Emperor from his worshippers, yet can even calculate the strategic advantage that religious fervor provides to Imperial forces. But he cannot feel what it means to believe, cannot experience the transformation that occurs when consciousness touches the divine, cannot grasp from the inside what separates a powerful psyker from a god. The pariah nexus, then, represents both the height of Necron knowledge and the limit of their understanding. They know that cutting off the warp cripples the Imperium. They know that humans need organic bodies and warp connections. They know that the Emperor's power flows through psychic channels that can be disrupted. They know all of this with the precision of scientists who have spent 60 million years mastering the fundamental forces of reality. But they do not know, and perhaps cannot know, that some things transcend science, that the relationship between humanity and the Emperor exists in realms that no amount of study can fully illuminate when you approach from the outside. The pariah nexus will expand if the Silent King has his way, eventually creating null zones across the entire galaxy, sealing off the warp from real space forever. This would indeed destroy the Imperium as it currently exists, but it might also destroy the Necrons' chances of ever regaining what they lost, For if the warp is sealed away completely, if that connection is severed for all living things, then there will be no organic vessels suitable for reverse biotransference, no souls to anchor consciousness in flesh. As the Silent King risks winning the war, but losing the one thing he truly wants, restoration of what was stolen when he accepted the Satan's bargain all those millions of years ago. What individual Necrons might know? While we focused primarily on the knowledge held by the Silent King, the highest echelons of Necron leadership, we must also consider what information might be possessed by individual Necrons across the various tomb worlds and dynasties. The Necron Empire, even at its height, was not a monolith. Different dynasties maintained their own cultures, their own approaches to warfare and technology, their own archives and records. When the Necrons entered the Great Sleep, each tomb world became isolated, its revival systems programmed independently, its inhabitants sealed away in their own crypts without connection to other worlds. The Great Awakening has been chaotic and uncoordinated, with tomb worlds stirring at different times, finding themselves in vastly different strategic situations and making their own assessments of the galaxy they've returned to. This means that knowledge of the Emperor is likely fragmentary and inconsistent across Necron forces, with some dynasties knowing much and others knowing almost nothing. An overlord whose tomb world woke during the Great Crusade and fought against Space Marine legions would have direct experience of the Imperium at its peak, memories of encountering warriors who called upon the Emperor's name in battle. But an overlord whose tomb world only recently stirred might know the Emperor only as a name encountered in intercepted Imperial transmissions, a distant figure whose significance is unclear. The cryptex, the technological specialists and scientists of Necron society, would be particularly important sources of knowledge about the Emperor. These beings dedicate themselves to studying and mastering the sciences that underpin their civilization, everything from gravitational manipulation to chronometry to the esoteric arts that blur the line between technology and what other species might call magic. When a tomb world awakens, its cryptex immediately begin gathering information about the current state of the galaxy, analyzing any data they can access, attempting to understand what has changed during their long sleep. A cryptex studying the Imperium would quickly identify the Emperor as a key figure, someone whose existence and power shape the structure of human civilization. They would analyze the Astronomicon, and attempting to understand the mechanism by which a psychic beacon can function on such a vast scale. They would study Space Marine gene seed, trying to comprehend how organic engineering could produce warriors of such capability. They would examine Imperial technology, looking for insights into what humanity knows and what it has forgotten from the dark age of technology. All of this study would gradually build a picture of the Emperor as a being of immense psychic power who engineered humanity's expansion through careful application of genetic manipulation, strategic planning, and psychic might. But here's where the problem of memory degradation becomes significant. The Necrons who woke with their consciousness intact, who retained clear memories and strong cognitive function, are in the minority. But most Necrons suffered damage during the Great Sleep, their neural architectures degrading over millions of years, their memories becoming fragmented, their ability to process complex information reduced. The common Necron warriors, the foot soldiers who make up the bulk of Necron armies, are little more than automatons, following programmed instructions without true understanding. They know about the Emperor only in the most basic sense, as a designation attached to enemy forces, a target to be eliminated when encountered. Immortals and Lichguard, higher-grade warrior constructs, retain more cognitive capacity, but still lack the flexibility and creativity of thought that characterized them when they were Necron-tire. Even among the overlords and lords, the nobility who command Necron forces, many have suffered degradation that leaves their minds capable of tactical thought, but struggling with abstract concepts or long-term planning. These damaged Necrons might recognize that the Emperor is important to humanity, might understand that eliminating him would serve Necron interests, but they lack the depth of understanding that would let them grasp why the Emperor matters. or what his nature truly represents. The Awakened Council, an organization established by early waking Necrons to coordinate their efforts before the Silent King's return, represents an interesting case study in how knowledge spreads through Necron society. This council was formed at least 10,000 years before the 41st Millennium, when scattered tomb worlds began waking to find themselves isolated and cut off from the unified Necron Empire. All without central leadership, these early waking Necrons needed some mechanism to resolve disputes between dynasties, to coordinate responses to threats, to share information about the changed galaxy they found themselves in. The Awakened Council served this purpose, bringing together representatives from various dynasties to share intelligence and make collective decisions. Members of the Awakened Council would have been among the first Necrons to encounter the Imperium during its expansion. They would have fought against the Great Crusade, witnessed the Horus Heresy from a distance, observed the Imperium's slow transformation from a secular empire into a theocracy. Their records and reports would form a crucial archive of information about the Emperor and humanity's evolution over thousands of years. When the Silent King finally returned, he would have accessed these archives, incorporating their knowledge into his own understanding. But the Awakened Council itself dissolved when the Silent King reasserted his authority, its members returning to their various dynasties and taking their knowledge with them. Different Necron dynasties have different relationships to knowledge and different cultural attitudes that shape what they know and how they use that knowledge. The Sautek dynasty, for example, values military efficiency and strategic innovation. Their forces are known for aggressive tactics and rapid technological adaptation. A Sautek overlord studying the Emperor would focus on his capabilities as a military commander, his success in creating and deploying the Space Marine legions, his strategic planning that allowed humanity to expand so rapidly during the Great Crusade. They would care less about the Emperor's philosophical goals or spiritual significance, and more about his effectiveness as a war leader and how to counter the military advantages he provided to humanity. The Nihilak dynasty, in contrast, is known for its technological conservatism and its obsessive defense of Necron tomb worlds. They view any other species on worlds that once belonged to the Necrons as trespassers to be eliminated. Their knowledge of the Emperor would be filtered through this lens, seeing him primarily as the architect of humanity's expansion onto Necron territory, the force responsible for billions of humans settling on worlds that rightfully belong to the Necron Empire. They would know him as the source of the problem they're trying to solve, the reason they have to fight rather than simply claiming empty worlds. The Sarkhan dynasty, the Silent King's own dynasty, would have the most comprehensive knowledge of the Emperor, benefiting from direct access to whatever intelligence the Silent King has gathered during his exile and his return. Warriors and overlords of the Sarkhan dynasty would be briefed on the Emperor's significance, his role in the Imperium structure, his current state on the Golden Throne. They would understand that the Pariah Nexus is designed specifically to counter the advantages the Emperor provides to humanity. But even here, even among the best-informed Necrons, there would be limits to understanding. The Sarkhan dynasty knows what the Silent King chooses to tell them. He knows what can be communicated through reports and briefings and strategic directives. They cannot know the full depth of what the Silent King has learned through his millions of years of contemplation and his direct encounters with Imperial forces. And the Silent King himself, as we've discussed, has fundamental blind spots in his understanding, stemming from his inability to truly grasp what faith and belief mean to organic beings connected to the warp. There's also the question of how knowledge spreads between Necron forces. Unlike the Imperium, with its astropaths and real-time communication across the galaxy, the Necrons rely on physical transmission of information. A tomb world that makes a discovery about the Emperor cannot instantly share that knowledge with all other Necrons. They must send messengers, transmit data through conventional means, wait for the information to propagate through whatever limited networks exist between awakened dynasties. This means that knowledge is fragmented, with different tomb worlds operating on different information sets, sometimes coming to contradictory conclusions based on limited data. One dynasty might conclude that the Emperor is effectively dead, and poses no threat, while another dynasty that has encountered Space Marine chapters might recognize that his influence continues to shape the Imperium profoundly. Without central coordination, without a unified intelligence service that collates all available information, the Necrons as a whole lack a comprehensive understanding of the Emperor. They have pieces of the puzzle scattered across thousands of tomb worlds, but no one has assembled all those pieces into a complete picture. Power assessment. When Necron strategists attempt to assess the Emperor's power, they face challenges that go beyond simple measurement. Power, from a Necron perspective, can be quantified and compared. They understand destructive capacity, can measure the energy output of weapons, can calculate the tactical advantage provided by superior technology or strategic position. They are master engineers who have built devices that can crack planets, weapons that can strip matter to its component atoms, shields that can absorb the energy of a supernova. In their framework, power is a variable that can be measured, analyzed, and countered through sufficient application of science and planning. But the Emperor's power doesn't fit neatly into these categories. His psychic might transcends simple energy measurement. His strategic influence extends across 10,000 years of human history. His impact on the galaxy comes as much from what he represents as from what he can directly do. How do you measure the power of a being who exists simultaneously as a dying corpse on a throne, as a psychic presence that spans the galaxy, as a god in the minds of trillions of believers, and as a force fighting eternal war in the warp itself? The Necrons would attempt such measurements anyway, because it's what they do, but their conclusions would necessarily be incomplete and potentially misleading. The most obvious metric of the Emperor's power is his psychic capability. As we've established, the Emperor is the most powerful human psyker ever to exist. Perhaps the most powerful psyker of any species in the current galaxy. His ability to maintain the Astronomicon while simultaneously fighting the Chaos Gods in the warp demonstrates a level of multitasking and power projection that the Necrons would have to acknowledge as formidable even by the standards of the Old Ones. When they compare the Emperor to beings they've encountered before, the closest analogue would be the Old Ones themselves, those ancient beings whose mastery of the warp allowed them to create races and reshape reality. The Necrons fought the Old Ones and won, but only after allying with the Catan and undergoing biotransference to gain the power they needed. An individual Necron tire, no matter how skilled or well-equipped, would have stood no chance against an Old One. The Necrons today, as with all their advanced technology and military might, would recognize that a being of the Emperor's psychic caliber represents a similar level of threat. He might not be invulnerable, but eliminating him would require careful planning and overwhelming force. The Emperor's victory over the Void Dragon Shard provides a concrete data point for Necron assessment. The Satan, even in shard form, were among the most powerful entities in the galaxy during the War in Heaven. They could consume stars, manipulate matter at the most fundamental levels, and existed on a scale that transcended organic comprehension. For a psyker, no matter how powerful, to defeat and imprison such a being represents an achievement that the Necrons cannot dismiss. They would study the accounts of this battle, analyze whatever information the Void Dragon itself could provide about the encounter, and attempt to understand the mechanisms by which the Emperor overcame a star god. Their conclusion would likely focus on the Emperor's exploitation of the Citan's fundamental weakness, lack of warp resistance. The Citan exist purely in real space and have no natural defense against warp-based attacks. The Emperor, as a supreme master of psychic power, could employ exactly the weapons that the Citan were most vulnerable to. This doesn't diminish the achievement, but it does provide context. The Emperor won not through superior raw power, but through exploiting a specific vulnerability using capabilities the Citan couldn't match. The Necrons, who themselves learned to exploit enemy weaknesses during the War in Heaven, would respect this approach, while noting that it doesn't necessarily translate to superiority in all contexts. The Emperor's creation of the Primarchs represents another demonstration of power that the Necrons would have to assess carefully. Genetic engineering at that level, creating 20 superhuman beings, each designed to embody different aspects of warfare and leadership, goes beyond anything the Imperium has been able to replicate since. The Primarchs combined genetic perfection with warp-based enhancements in ways that blurred the line between science and sorcery. Each Primarch possessed abilities that pushed the boundaries of what biology should allow. Sanguinius's wings, Magnus's psychic might, Vulcan's perpetual resurrection, Corvus Corax's ability to manipulate shadows. The Necrons. As master genetic engineers themselves during their time as Necrontire would recognize the sophistication required to create such beings. They would note that the Emperor accomplished in a few decades what should have taken centuries or millennia of iterative development and testing. This suggests either access to knowledge that no one else in the galaxy possesses, or psychic abilities so profound that they allow direct manipulation of genetic code at levels beyond conventional engineering. Either way, it marks the Emperor as a being whose capabilities extend into realms the Necrons struggle to match despite their technological superiority in many other areas. But perhaps most significant from a Necron strategic perspective is the Emperor's ability to inspire and organize humanity on a galactic scale. The Necrons understand empire building, and they once ruled across the stars, commanding forces that numbered in the trillions, coordinating operations across thousands of light years. But they achieved this through their command protocols, through hierarchical structures enforced by technology that made disobedience literally impossible for most Necrons. The Emperor built the Imperium through a combination of military conquest, political genius, and charismatic leadership that inspired loyalty rather than simply commanding it. He took a species that had been shattered into isolated pockets during the Age of Strife and united it under a single vision, a shared purpose that survived his internment on the Golden Throne and continued to motivate billions of humans for 10,000 years. This is power of a different sort than psychic might or technological prowess, but it's no less real and perhaps more durable. The Imperium persists despite the Emperor's inability to actively lead it, sustained by the institutions he created and the faith that has grown around his figure. The Necrons, who struggle to maintain unity among their various dynasties, even with the Silent King's return, would have to acknowledge this as a remarkable achievement. When comparing the Emperor's power to that of the Silent King, the assessment becomes more complex. The Silent King is ancient beyond human comprehension, has access to technologies that can reshape matter at the quantum level, commands forces that include weapons capable of destroying stars. He personally led the rebellion against the Citan, shattering gods who had seemed invincible, developing weapons so terrible that he erased knowledge of them afterward. His strategic planning spans millions of years. His understanding of physics and engineering exceeds anything humanity has achieved even at its height. In a direct contest of material power, of physical capability, and technological sophistication, the Silent King would likely prevail. His Blackstone technology can counter psychic abilities. His forces can resurrect from destruction. His knowledge of warfare predates human civilization by epochs. But the Emperor has one crucial advantage that the Silent King can never match: connection to the warp, understanding of how faith and belief shape reality, ability to draw on the worship of trillions to sustain his power. The Silent King can create zones where psychic power fails, but he cannot make himself psychic. Chess cannot touch the dimension that the Emperor navigates as naturally as the Necrons navigate real space. The comparison ultimately reveals the fundamental difference in how these two beings approach power. The Silent King embodies the Necron ideal: power through knowledge, through technology, through mastery of the physical universe's laws. The Emperor represents something the Necrons can barely comprehend: power through faith, through the collective belief of a species, through influence that extends beyond individual capability into the realm of myth and divinity. Neither approach is strictly superior. Each has strengths and vulnerabilities. The Silent King's technology can create the pariah nexus and counter psychic advantages. but it cannot inspire the kind of fanatical loyalty that drives Imperial soldiers to fight beyond hope of survival. The Emperor's power sustains the Imperium and holds back the Chaos Gods, but it depends on humanity maintaining their faith, on the continued sacrifice of psykers to feed the Golden Throne, on systems that could collapse if key components fail. The Necrons would assess both sides of this equation, recognizing that the Emperor represents a kind of power that their own civilization deliberately rejected when they accepted biotransference, and wondering whether they made the right choice all those millions of years ago. Strategic implications. Understanding what the Necrons know about the Emperor leads naturally to questions of strategy and how that knowledge shapes Necron decision-making regarding the Imperium.
The Necrons face a complex strategic environment in which the Emperor plays a central role, not because they want to focus on him specifically, but because his influence on the galaxy's balance of power is impossible to ignore. Any Necron plan for galactic reconquest must account for the Imperium's strength and reach, and any assessment of the Imperium must grapple with the question of how central the Emperor is to humanity's continued cohesion. This creates strategic dilemmas that even the Silent King's ancient wisdom struggles to resolve. On one hand, the Emperor represents a crucial vulnerability in the Imperium's structure. He is a single point of failure, a being whose death or permanent destruction would trigger cascading failures across human civilization. Without the Astronomicon, warp travel becomes vastly more dangerous. Without the Emperor's presence fighting the Chaos Gods in the warp, demonic incursions would multiply exponentially. Without the unifying symbol of the God Emperor, the Imperium's various factions might fracture into competing powers, each claiming legitimacy, but none possessing universal authority. From a purely tactical perspective, assassinating the Emperor or destroying the Golden Throne should be a top priority for anyone seeking to cripple humanity. But the Necrons, with their long experience and their understanding of how systems fail, recognize that removing the Emperor might not serve their interests. The chaos that would follow his death could be worse, from a Necron perspective, than the ordered opposition the Imperium currently provides. Think about what happens if the Golden Throne fails and the Emperor dies. The Astronomicon goes dark immediately. Tens of thousands of ships currently navigating the warp would be lost, their navigators blinded, their vessels trapped in the Imperium until they're consumed by demons or emerge decades or centuries later in random locations. The Imperium would lose its primary means of coordinating across vast distances. Planets would be cut off from Terra, from each other, from the protection of the Imperial military. This would create opportunities for Necron expansion, certainly. Isolated human worlds would be easy prey for awakened tomb worlds seeking to reclaim their former territory. But it would also create opportunities for chaos, for the Tyranids, for greenskin hordes and elder raiders and every other threat in the galaxy. As the carefully maintained balance of power would collapse into a free-for-all, where the Necrons would have to compete against multiple existential threats simultaneously. Worse, the Emperor's death might trigger a warp catastrophe that makes the current state of the galaxy look stable. The Emperor has been fighting the Chaos Gods for 10,000 years, holding them back through constant psychic struggle. If he falls, if that resistance ends, the Chaos Gods would surge forward with renewed vigor. The Great Rift might expand, consuming entire sectors. New eyes of terror could open across the galaxy as the barrier between real space and the warp weakens without the Emperor's strength maintaining it. Demon worlds would proliferate. Warp storms would rage unchecked. And the Necrons, for all their immunity to demonic corruption, would still have to navigate a galaxy where real space itself became unreliable, where physics could be overwritten by warp phenomena, where their carefully constructed plans would be undermined by chaos in its most literal sense. The Silent King, who lived through the end of the war in heaven and witnessed how the enslavers nearly destroyed all life in the galaxy, would be particularly sensitive to this risk. He knows what happens when the warp overflows into real space without sufficient opposition. He watched his own victory over the Old Ones transform into a crisis that forced the Necrons into their great sleep. He will not risk triggering another such crisis, not when the Necrons are still weak and divided, not when the galaxy is already teetering on the edge of darkness. Yet this means that Necron's strategy regarding the Emperor is characterized by careful calibration rather than outright assault. The Pariah Nexus represents this approach perfectly. It attacks the foundation of the Emperor's power, his reliance on warp connections and psychic energy, without directly targeting him. By creating zones where psychic power fails, the Necrons can expand their territory and weaken the Imperium without triggering the catastrophic collapse that the Emperor's death might cause. The stilling effect slowly undermines human civilization within the null zones, making populations easier to control or eliminate while preserving the infrastructure and planetary resources that the Necrons might want to reclaim. Meanwhile, as the expansion of the Pariah Nexus serves the Silent King's longer-term goal of finding a way to reverse biotransference. If he can preserve enough humans in a tractable state, he can conduct the experiments he needs to determine whether organic bodies can host Necron consciousness. This is patient strategy, thinking in terms of decades or centuries rather than the immediate gratification of destroying an enemy. The Necrons also recognize that the Emperor serves a useful function in organizing opposition to other threats. The Imperium, for all its xenophobia and aggression toward Necron forces, also fights against chaos, against the Tyranids, against greenskin hordes that would otherwise spread unchecked. Every Chaos warband destroyed by the Imperial military is one less threat the Necrons have to deal with. And every Tyranid hive fleet that throws itself against Imperial defenses is one that's not devouring worlds the Necrons might want to reclaim. The Emperor's existence sustains this arrangement, maintaining an Imperium powerful enough to contest other major factions, while not being so overwhelmingly dominant that the Necrons couldn't eventually overcome them. If the Emperor dies, and the Imperium fragments, those other threats don't disappear. They multiply and spread without the organized opposition the Imperium provides. The Necrons would find themselves fighting wars on multiple fronts against enemies that might not be individually as organized as the Imperium, but collectively represent equal or greater danger. This strategic calculation, this recognition that sometimes enemies serve useful purposes, informs Necron decisions about how aggressively to challenge Imperial expansion. There's also the question of whether the Necrons even could kill the Emperor if they tried. His physical body sits upon the Golden Throne, protected by layers of defenses that make it one of the most secure locations in the galaxy. The Imperial Palace on Terra is defended by the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guardians, warriors whose capabilities exceed even the Space Marines. Getting a strike force through Terra's orbital defenses, through the palace's fortifications, past the Custodes, to the Golden Throne itself, would require resources and planning on a scale that few Necron dynasties could muster. And even if they succeeded, even if they stood before the Emperor's withered form and prepared to strike the final blow, what then? What, the Emperor is not simply a physical being. He's a psychic presence that exists as much in the warp as in real space. Destroying his body might not destroy him, might instead release his consciousness fully into the immaterium, where he would become something even more dangerous. A fully realized warp entity, a god of order and humanity untethered from physical form. The Necrons, who saw the Chaos Gods born from the suffering of the war in heaven, who witnessed the creation of Slaanesh from the fall of the Eldar, would be justifiably cautious about triggering the birth of another warp god, even if that god initially opposed chaos. So the Necrons find themselves in a position where they know much about the Emperor, understand his significance to the Imperium structure, recognize both his power and his vulnerabilities, yet choose not to act directly against him. This is not cowardice or indecision. It's strategic sophistication, the kind of nuanced thinking that comes from millions of years of experience in galactic warfare. The Silent King, in particular, embodies this approach. He has learned, painfully, that the most obvious solution to a problem is not always the best one. He accepted the Satan's offer of immortality and doomed his entire species to eternal existence in machine bodies. He won the war in heaven and triggered a warp catastrophe that forced him into exile for 60 million years. He is not going to repeat those mistakes by short-sightedly removing the Emperor without considering the full implications of such an action. Instead, he builds the Pariah Nexus, slowly expanding zones of null space that undermine the Emperor's advantages while avoiding the catastrophic risks of direct confrontation. He preserves human populations for study and potential exploitation. He coordinates with other Necron dynasties to ensure that when the time comes to make a decisive move, the Necrons will be united and prepared rather than scattered and vulnerable. Conclusion. We've journeyed through 60 million years of history, across the vast gulf that separates the Necrons' experiences from humanity's brief moment in the galactic spotlight, to arrive at a question that seems simple, but reveals itself to be endlessly complex. What do the Necrons know about the Emperor? The answer, as we've discovered, is that they know much and they know little. Their knowledge vast in some areas and utterly absent in others, as shaped by perspectives so alien to human understanding that even their most accurate observations are filtered through lenses that distort what they see. The Necrons know that the Emperor exists, that he is a psyker of immense power, that he rules the Imperium from the Golden Throne despite being effectively dead, that his creation of the Space Marines and the Astronomicon has shaped humanity's dominance of the galaxy. They know these facts with the precision of beings who have spent millennia studying their enemies, cataloguing their capabilities, assessing their vulnerabilities. The Silent King, in particular, possesses detailed intelligence gathered through direct observation, through encounters with Imperial forces, through analysis of the Void Dragon's memories of its imprisonment. He understands the Emperor's strategic genius, while his ability to plan across millennia, his mastery of both psychic power and genetic engineering. But the Necrons also know nothing, or rather, they cannot know the most essential things about the Emperor, because those things exist in realms their consciousness cannot reach. They cannot know what it feels like to have faith in the God Emperor, to draw strength from belief, to experience the presence of the divine in the midst of battle. They cannot understand how the Emperor transforms from man to myth to God through the worship of his followers, how his power is sustained not just by his own psychic might, but by the collective faith of trillions of humans who pray to him daily. They cannot grasp the mystery of how a being can exist simultaneously as a corpse on a throne, a psychic presence spanning the galaxy, and a god fighting eternal war in the warp. These are experiential realities that require connection to the warp, that demand the ability to feel faith and belief and spiritual transformation, things the Necrons lost when they accepted biotransference and had their souls burned away in the Citan's furnaces. The irony is profound. The Necrons, who remember when the galaxy was young, who fought wars that shaped the universe's fundamental structure, who possess technology that can crack planets and calm warp storms, are blind to the very things that make the Emperor significant. This blindness creates strategic opportunities and strategic risks. The Necrons can exploit the Emperor's reliance on psychic infrastructure, can build the Pariah Nexus to neutralize the Astronomicon and cripple warp-dependent Imperial systems. They can assess his military capabilities and plan around them, can identify weaknesses in the Imperium structure and probe them with the patient thoroughness that comes from thinking in terms of millennia rather than years. But they cannot predict how faith will move humans to fight beyond rational hope, cannot anticipate the miracles that belief sometimes manifests, cannot fully account for the Emperor's ability to inspire generations of warriors who have never met him but know his name as the holiest word in their vocabulary. The Silent King makes plans that account for physics and technology and strategic positioning, but he cannot plan for the moment when an Imperial guardsman, facing certain death, prays to the Emperor and finds strength to fight on when all logic says he should flee.
that he cannot quantify the advantage that worship provides, cannot measure it in any units his science understands. As we close this exploration, we're left with a picture of two forces, the Necrons and the Emperor, who are fundamentally mismatched in ways that transcend simple comparisons of power. The Necrons represent the pinnacle of material science, beings who have mastered reality's physical laws to such a degree that they can perform miracles through technology alone. The Emperor represents the pinnacle of psychic evolution, a being who transcends physical limitations through sheer force of will and connection to the warp. When these forces collide, when Necron warriors face space marines calling upon the Emperor's name, when the Silent King's pariah nexus presses against the Imperium's psychic infrastructure, we witness not just a military conflict, but a philosophical one. Which is real, the universe that can be measured and engineered, or the universe that exists in faith and belief? The Necrons chose one answer 60 million years ago. The Emperor, and through him humanity, has chosen the other. And in the grim darkness of the far future, in this galaxy that offers no peace and no quarter, both sides will continue to press their case with Bolter and Gauss Flayer, with prayer and pyramid, until one vision prevails or the galaxy burns to ash in the conflict. The Necrons know the Emperor as a threat, as an obstacle to their reconquest, as a psyker who must be countered and contained. They know the Imperium he created as a civilization, built on foundations they despise, relying on the very warp powers that they have spent millions of years learning to nullify and destroy. They know that removing him might serve their short-term tactical interests, but risk catastrophic long-term consequences. And so they move forward with characteristic patience, expanding the pariah nexus, preserving human specimens for biotransference experiments, slowly chipping away at the Emperor's advantages while avoiding the decisive confrontation that might trigger the collapse of galactic civilization itself. Whether this strategy will succeed, whether the Silent King's ancient wisdom can navigate the complexities of the current era, whether the Necrons will ever truly understand what drives humanity to worship a dying corpse as a god, these questions remain unanswered as the galaxy slides toward futures darker than any past. But one thing is certain. The knowledge the Necrons possess about the Emperor, vast as it is in some ways and utterly lacking in others, will shape their decisions and their destiny as they awaken tomb by tomb to reclaim an empire that existed before humanity learned to stand upright. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the Necron perspective on the Emperor, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We've got plenty more Warhammer 40k lore coming your way, exploring the hidden corners of the galaxy and the mysteries that even the Adeptus Terra keeps locked in their deepest vaults. The Emperor protects, but knowledge illuminates. Until next time, stay vigilant in the darkness between stars.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.